My name is Clara Voss and I was 38 years old, standing in the vestibule of St. Andrew's Church on a Tuesday morning in November, when I picked up the funeral program from the table by the door and read my husband's name on the cover, Daniel Voss, beloved son, devoted brother. I read it twice. I turned it over. I opened it. My name was not inside, not as his wife, not as his surviving spouse, not in any of the places where a wife of 9 years appears in the formal record of a man's life. The program listed his mother Margaret, his brother Thomas, his sister Anne, his nieces and nephews by name, a line about his love of hiking and his career in architecture and the years he had spent volunteering at a youth mentoring program in the city. No Clara, no wife, no us. I stood in that vestibule with 200 people moving past me into the church, and I understood, with the specific cold clarity of a person who has just seen something they cannot unsee, that this had not been an oversight. I had written the original obituary. I had written it at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning 4 days after Daniel died, with a cup of tea going cold beside me and his photograph open on my phone, and I had written it the way you write something when the person it is about was the center of your life for 9 years and you were trying to find language adequate to that. I had sent it to the funeral home. I had confirmed it with the director. I had seen the proof. What was in my hand was not the proof I had approved. Before I tell you what happened next, please hit like and subscribe. Drop your city and local time in the comments. I read every single one. Now let me take you back to where this really started. Not to the vestibule, not to the program. Further back, to a marriage that was good and a grief that was real and a woman who had spent 9 years deciding that her son's wife was a temporary condition. Daniel Voss was 41 when he died. He was an architect who designed public buildings, libraries, and community centers and schools, the kind of structures built to outlast the people who funded them. He had a quality I have never found the right word for except to say that rooms felt different when he was in them. Not louder, not more dramatic, but more considered, as though the space itself had been thought about more carefully. He laughed easily and cooked badly and remembered every conversation he had ever had with every person he had ever met, which made him the kind of friend people called first and the kind of husband who knew, without being reminded, that the anniversary of my mother's death was harder than the anniversary of her birthday. He had been diagnosed with a rare cardiac condition 14 months before he died. Not a condition that announced itself dramatically, the kind that is managed carefully for years and then, without sufficient warning, is not manageable anymore. He had handled the diagnosis with the same considered quality he brought to everything, gathering information, asking the right questions, making adjustments, and continuing to live with a fullness that I understood, only after he was gone, had been partly deliberate. He had known the odds. He had chosen not to spend his remaining time inside them. He had also, in those 14 months, done several things quietly that I did not know about until after his death. I will describe them in the order I discovered them because the order matters. Daniel's mother Margaret was 67. She was a retired schoolteacher from a small town 3 hours from the city where Daniel and I had built our life, and she was the specific kind of woman who loves her children with a completeness that leaves no room for the people her children love. This is not a unique type. It is recognizable to anyone who has spent time inside a family organized around one person's emotional gravity. Margaret's gravity was her son's, and of her sons, Daniel was the primary one, the firstborn, the one who had her eyes and her father's temperament and the quality of presence I described above that she had recognized before anyone else did. She had not disliked me. I want to be careful about this because the story is easier if she had simply disliked me, and I do not think that was exactly it. What she had done, for 9 years, was treat me as provisional. As someone whose presence in her son's life was real but not permanent, not in the way that a son was permanent, not in the way that blood was permanent. She had been pleasant at holidays and careful at family events, and she had said my name the way you say the name of a guest in a house you own, with hospitality but without the specific warmth that comes from believing the person belongs there. Daniel knew. We had talked about it over the years with the honesty that good marriages allow, and he had named it more clearly than I had, which was like him. He said once, on a Sunday afternoon, that his mother loved the idea of him having a life without being fully able to love the life he actually had. He said it without bitterness. He said it the way he said true things that were also sad, with the acceptance of someone who has decided that understanding a thing is more useful than being angry about it. He was right about that. He was right about most things. I am still learning to live with how right he usually was. The 14 months of his illness changed the temperature of everything, including Margaret. She came to the city more often. She sat with him on the days when the medication made him tired, and the tiredness was the particular kind that required company rather than solitude. She cooked the foods he had grown up eating and brought them in containers labeled in her handwriting, and she was, in those months, genuinely present in a way she had not always been. I want to give her that. Even now, even knowing what she did to the program, I want to give her those months because they were real. What was also real was the conversation I had not been part of. The one I learned about afterward, from Daniel's sister Anne, who told me about it 6 weeks after the funeral with the the specific discomfort of someone delivering information they believe the recipient deserves and cannot protect them from. In the final weeks of Daniel's life, Margaret had spoken to him about what she wanted the funeral to look like and had been present for part of it. Margaret had expressed, in the careful language she used for things she understood were not strictly hers to decide, that she felt the funeral should focus on Daniel as a son and a brother, that she felt the service should reflect the family he had come from, that she hoped it would be something his hometown community could attend and feel connected to. Daniel had listened. He had said, "Mom, Clara will handle the arrangement. She knows what I want." Margaret had said she understood. She had nodded and changed the subject and told me that after Daniel lost consciousness in the final days, Margaret had called the funeral home directly. She had spoken with a director named Stuart who was new to the home and who had not yet worked with me and who had, apparently, processed the changes Margaret requested without flagging them against the submission I had already made. Margaret had not rewritten the obituary entirely. She had made specific changes. She had removed my name from the list of survivors. She had removed the phrase beloved husband. She had added language about Daniel's early years in his hometown and his relationship with his family of origin. She had not mentioned me anywhere in 4 pages of text about a man who had been my husband for 9 years. I found out standing in a church vestibule with 200 people moving past me. I want to tell you what I did in that moment because I have thought about it many times and I am still not certain I did the right thing, though I did what I was capable of doing. I folded the program. I put it in my bag. I walked into the church. I sat in the front pew on the left side, which was where the family had agreed I would sit, and I held the hands of the people beside me and I listened to the eulogies and I said goodbye to my husband in the presence of everyone who had loved him, which included me regardless of what the program said. I did not make a scene. I did not confront Margaret in the vestibule or at the graveside or at the reception afterward in the church hall where the food was good and the photographs were everywhere and several of them included me and my name was not on a single program in the building. I made this choice for 2 reasons. The first was that Daniel would not have wanted a scene at his funeral. He would have wanted, very specifically, for his funeral to be about his life rather than about his mother's management of it. The second reason was that I had 3 things in my bag besides the program that told me I did not need the program to be who I was. I had received them the morning of the funeral from Daniel's attorney, a woman named Grace Ellison, who had called me at 7 in the morning before I left the house and asked if she could bring something by. She had arrived at 7:30 with a folder and the expression of a woman who had been trusted with something important and intended to deliver it correctly. Inside the folder were 3 documents that Daniel had left with Grace 14 months earlier, 2 months after his diagnosis, with instructions that they be given to me on the morning of his funeral, not before. The morning of. He had been specific about the timing. The first document was a letter, handwritten, 4 pages, his architect's handwriting, precise and clear with the specific slant. I had watched film notebooks and blueprints and birthday cards for 9 years. I will not give you the full contents of that letter because most of it belongs to me and to no one else. What I will tell you is that he had written about our 9 years together with the completeness of a man who understood he was writing for permanent. He had written about the specific qualities of our life, the ordinary ones, Sunday mornings, and the argument we had every year about how early to leave for the airport and the way I organized the bookshelves by color and he reorganized them by subject, and we had reached a détente in which the living room shelves were by color and the study shelves were by subject. He had written about what I had given him during his illness, not the logistic, though he acknowledged those, but the quality of presence, the willingness to be with him in whatever the day was rather than performing a version of okayness that would have been easier for both of us and less true. He had also written, specifically and without drama, about his mother. He said he knew what she was capable of. He said he loved her completely and clearly and that loving her completely and clearly meant seeing her clearly, and what he saw was a woman who would try, when he was gone, to revise the record of his life into a story that centered her grief rather than his choices. He said he had taken steps to ensure that the record could not be permanently revised. The second document in the folder was a legal instrument I will describe carefully because it matters. Daniel had worked with Grace to establish what she described to me as a legacy protection arrangement. It was not a standard estate document. It was a specific set of legal instructions that addressed the public record of his life, including his obituary, any memorial publications, the records of his architectural firm, and the disposition of personal correspondence and creative work. The arrangement designated me as the sole authorized person to approve any public statement about Daniel's life or work made in his name or in the name of his estate. This document had been filed with the appropriate legal bodies 14 months before his death. It was valid. It was, Grace told me, also something she had never been asked to create before in 20 years of estate law practice. She said Daniel had come to her with a clear understanding of what he wanted and a clear explanation of why he wanted it. She said he had been the calmest client she had ever worked with on the most difficult kind of paperwork that sounded like him. The third document was a corrected obituary, written by Daniel himself, in full, with instructions that it be submitted to the appropriate publications by Grace on the morning of the funeral. It had already been submitted by the time she came to my door. It would appear in the city newspaper that evening and in the architectural industry publication the following week. It included my name. It described me as his wife and his partner and the person who had made his last 14 months into something he had not expected them to be, which was full. It described our 9 years together with the same specificity and warmth he had used in the letter. It was 4 paragraphs and it was everything the program in my bag was not. I sat in that front pew and I held these 3 things in the folder in my bag and I listened to the eulogies and I cried for my husband and I said goodbye to him in the only way that mattered, which was honestly and completely and with the full weight of 9 years of choosing each other. Margaret sat across the aisle in the right front pew. I did not look at her often. When I did, she was looking at the casket or at the speaker or at her hands. Once, near the end of the service, she looked at me. Her expression was not triumphant. It was the expression of a woman who has done something she believed was right and is not yet certain whether it was and does not have enough information yet to know she would have more information by evening. Have you ever been erased from a record that was yours by right and had to decide whether to fight it in the moment or let something already in motion do the work? Tell me in the comment. I read every one. Subscribe so you are here for the part that Margaret did not see coming. Because what happened in the days after that funeral is the part of this story that still makes me sit quietly and feel something I do not have a clean word for except that it is the specific weight of being loved carefully by someone who is no longer there to know it helped. The corrected obituary appeared in the city newspaper at 5 o'clock that evening. I know the exact time because Grace texted me when it went live and I was sitting in my car in the parking lot of the church hall, having stayed through the reception until the last guest left and the last casserole was covered and the last person had held my hands and told me what Daniel had meant to them, which was a great deal, which was what I had always known and which was both consoling and unbearable in the specific proportion that grief arranges these things. I read it in the car, his words, his handwriting translated to print, his name at the top and my name inside it and our 9 years described in the language of a man who understood that precision was a form of love. I cried in the parking lot for 20 minutes, not from sadness only, though the sadness was enormous, from the specific experience of being seen clearly by someone who had loved me and had made sure, from beyond wherever he was now, that the seeing was on record. Then I drove home. Margaret called the next morning at 8. I had expected the call. I had thought about whether to answer and had decided yes, because the conversation was coming regardless and because I preferred to have it with a clear head rather than build toward it over days of missed calls. She asked if I had seen the obituary in the paper. I said yes. She said, that is not what we discussed. I said, it is what Daniel wrote. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Daniel was not well at the end. He was not thinking clearly. I said, Daniel wrote that obituary 14 months ago, 2 months after his diagnosis, when he was cognitively intact and fully oriented. His attorney can confirm the date and the circumstances. Grace Ellison, you are welcome to call her. Another silence. Longer. She said, I am his mother. I said, I know. She said, I have a right to how my son is remembered. I said something I had thought about carefully before the call because I had known this sentence was coming and I had wanted to be ready for it. I said, you have the right to remember him however you need to. What you do not have is the right to revise the public record of his life without his consent. He gave his consent in writing 14 months ago, and he gave me the legal authority to protect it. The silence that followed was different from the earlier ones. It had a quality I recognized from the conversations I had been part of over 9 years when Margaret encountered something she could not manage around. A stillness that was not acceptance but was the pause before acceptance or the pause before the next attempt, and I could not tell yet which one. She said, you are doing this to hurt me. I said, I am doing this because it is what Daniel wanted. If you believe that hurts you, that is something to take up with what he chose and not with me. She said something then that surprised me, not because it was cruel, because it was honest in a way she was rarely honest with me. She said, I do not know how to grieve him if you are in the middle of it. I sat with that for a moment. I said, I understand that. I genuinely do. He was your son and you loved him first and you loved him longest. I am not trying to be in the middle of your grief. I am trying to be in the middle of mine, which is also real, which is also 9 years of a life that was ours and not only his. She did not say anything. I said, the obituary is his. It will stand. That is not negotiable and it is not personal. But I am not interested in fighting with you, Margaret. I am interested in grieving my husband and continuing the life he helped me build. If there is a version of the future where we can exist in each other's lives without this being a war, I am open to that. She said she needed time. I said I understood. She hung up. I set the phone on the kitchen table and looked at the window and at the garden Daniel had helped me plant the spring before his diagnosis, which had come through the fall better than either of us had expected. The calls from Margaret did not stop immediately. They came in waves over the following week, sometimes warm and sometimes not, sometimes about practical things related to the estate and sometimes about nothing practical practical at all, which told me she was processing and that the processing was not linear. I answered when I could and let the others go to voicemail when I needed to and called back when I had something to say. Daniel's sister and called me 2 weeks after the funeral. She said she had spoken to Margaret. She said the conversation had been difficult. She said Margaret had said things that Anne disagreed with and that she wanted me to know she disagreed with them. I thanked her. She said she had loved Daniel and that she had always thought he had chosen well and that she was sorry for what had happened with the program and the obituary. I told her the obituary had been handled. She said she knew. She said she had read it and that it was him, exactly, which was the truest thing anyone said to me in those weeks. Thomas, Daniel's brother, sent a card, handwritten, brief, which was like him. He said he missed his brother and that he was glad Daniel had had me. He said the last word twice, which I chose to believe was intentional. The estate settled over the following months in the way estates settle, with paperwork and patience and the specific bureaucratic weight of converting a life into a series of legal transactions. Grace handled it with the same precision she had brought to everything. The legacy protection arrangement meant that when Daniel's firm published a tribute to him in their professional materials, it went through me for approval before publication. I approved it. It was accurate and warm and included a photograph from the community center project he had loved most. The architectural industry obituary ran the week after the funeral. I read it 3 times. It described his work the way his work deserved to be described, with the specific understanding of someone who had known his buildings from the inside and the outside and understood that the difference between a good building and a great one was the quality of thought given to the person who would eventually stand inside it. That was Daniel. That was always what he was building for. The person who would eventually stand inside it. I think about that now when I think about the 3 documents in the folder. The letter and the legal arrangement and the corrected obituary. He had built those for me. Not dramatically, not as a gesture, but with the same considered precision he brought to every structure. He had identified a load-bearing point and he had reinforced it in advance, quietly, without telling me, because telling me would have required me to know what he was anticipating, and he had decided I did not need to carry that in advance. I carried it afterward instead. But carrying it afterward, when the structure he had built was already holding, was different from carrying it in anticipation. He understood that difference. He had always understood the difference between the weight you could spare someone and the weight you could only redistribute. Margaret and I have a relationship now that I would describe as careful. Not warm, not close, but careful in the specific sense of 2 people who have decided to treat each other with a respect that does not require pretending the last 9 years were other than what they were. She comes to the city twice a year. We have dinner. We talk about Daniel the way 2 people who both knew him talk about someone who was different things to each of them and was, in some essential way, himself to both. She has never directly acknowledged the obituary. I have not raised it. Some things are acknowledged through the changed behavior rather than the direct statement, and I watch for the changed behavior the way I watch for everything important, carefully and without announcing that I am watching. At our most recent dinner, in the fall, she said something that surprised me. She said she had been reading about his buildings, about the community center project specifically, which had been featured in an article the previous month. She said she had not fully understood, before reading the article, what he had been building toward. I said, he was always building for the person who would stand inside it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, that sounds like him. I said yes. The garden came back this spring better than ever, the way gardens sometimes do when you give them a winter to rest. Daniel had planted the climbing roses on the east fence the April before his diagnosis with the specific long-term thinking of a man who understood that the best plants take years to establish. They bloomed fully for the first time this May. I stood at the window on the morning they opened and I thought about the folder Grace had brought to my door on the morning of his funeral and about the letter inside it and about the specific quality of a man who builds things for the person who will eventually stand inside them. He had known I would be standing there. He had planned for that. He had made sure the structure would hold. I keep the letter in the drawer of my desk. Not the corrected obituary, though I have that too, in a different place. The letter specifically, in its envelope, in the drawer I open most often, so that it is there when I need it without my having to go looking for it. Some days I open it. Some days I do not. Either way it is there. The way he was always there, considered and precise and building for the long term, in the knowledge that the best structures outlast the moment they are built for. That is my story. 1 program in a vestibule, 1 folder at a door, and 9 years of a man who understood that love, when it is serious, does its most important work in advance. If this stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear that being seen clearly by someone who loves you is the most permanent thing that exists. Drop a comment and tell me about someone who prepared for you in a way you only understood after the fact. Hit subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.